You're listening to The Dirt on the Past, a show on history and archaeology and why it matters today. You can find us on the Extreme History Project website and also on kgbm.org. Thanks for listening. Welcome to The Dirt on the Past from the Extreme History Project and KGBM Community Radio.
Whether digging up a site or dusting off the archives, we bring you some of the most fascinating and cutting-edge research in history and archaeology and discuss why it matters today. Join me, Nancy Mahoney, alongside co-host Crystal Alegria, as we converse with anthropologists, archaeologists,
and historians about how they bring the past alive.
Welcome to this week's edition of The Dirt on the Past. I'm Nancy.
And I'm Crystal.
And we are the co-hosts of the program. This week, we're at the Extreme History headquarters, and we are going to be talking about the quote-unquote Venus figurines, the myths, facts, and objectifications surrounding those voluptuous ladies. Today, it's just going to be Crystal and I, who have both come from different routes to have an interest in this topic in two time periods that we both have spent some time visiting both physically and intellectually, sort of in the school book. So I'm interested in the Venus figurines of the Paleolithic period and have done some work on that. And you, Crystal, have a different period that you're familiar with.
Yeah, I'm interested in the Neolithic period, and we'll define what these periods are a little later on, but I'm interested in the Neolithic period and the Venus figurines from Malta, which is a small island in the Mediterranean.
So we wanted to talk about the Venus figurines because a lot of people have an idea of what Venus figurines are, that they're feminine figurines showing the female form and focusing on exaggerated contours of breasts, maybe the belly and the buttocks, and that these have been items that have been subject to a lot of pop culture interpretations and misrepresentations, and oddly, even some interesting scientific attempts to interpret how they might be used and how they might represent hardwiring in our biology. So we wanted to address some of what we see as what we know factually, what are true myths, and how these misrepresentations can kind of have these downsides of objectifying female form even in the present.
Right. And probably just so you can get an image in your mind of what we're talking about, the most popular one is the Venus of Willendorf, which was found in Austria. And so that might, if you just want to Google that, you'll get an idea of what we're talking
Even
about.
if you can't spell it, I bet it'll come up right away. It'll be the first one.
It's a really popular one.
So we can start talking about what we call the Upper Paleolithic period, which is about 36,000 BC. It goes back to 40,000 BC to about 12,000 BC, we'll say. And at 36,000 BC is the time period I throw out because that's when we think the oldest female figurine found dates to. That's the Holzfell figurine. The period after that we kind of call the Mesolithic. That's between about 12 and 8 to 10 BC. And then the period that we're also going to focus in on, aside from the Upper Paleolithic, is the Neolithic. And that's when people start settling down and farming. And that's between 8,000 to about 3,000, 2,000 BC or so. So the Upper Paleolithic, everyone is still hunter-gatherers. We're going to be talking about Europe, so everything from Western Europe through Eastern Europe up to Northern, over into a bit of Siberia, is sort of this region where these so-called Venus figurines have been found. That's also the place where we find a lot of other cave art and things like that. And everybody at this time are hunter-gatherers, including Neanderthals, which are still hanging on in parts of Europe, in, I believe, France, Spain, and Italy at least, maybe even Gibraltar, I believe, through about 20,000 years ago, I think.
When did Neanderthals start to die out?
Right. So they are living at 40,000 years ago when we get the first evidence for early modern humans entering into that part of Eastern and Western Europe, and they coexist for at least 10,000 years. And sometime between 30 and 20,000 years, their populations really seem to diminish, and then we don't see a lot of evidence for them really after 20,000 years ago.
Okay.
So if that helps anchor us.
That does.
Okay.
Yeah, that gives us a good kind of timeline and helps me anyway, kind of contextualize where we're at in time.
So I got interested in what I started calling the Venus hypothesis when I began teaching just human prehistory. So people come into the classroom and it's one of the things they know about. Maybe they've just come across it on the internet, articles they've read, or they've taken an art history course or anything, because it's some of the first representations we have of the human form on the planet, the oldest ones that we have. And what I know as one of the most persistent Venus hypotheses that are not well supported is that Venus figurines, with their often curvaceous representations of breast, hips, and buttocks, are presumed to have been basically paleoporn, or erotic art that was made by men for men. So it's not exactly clear what the evidence is that they would have been made by men or how they would have been used by men. But the hypothesis rests on a couple of assumptions. And from what I can tell from the literature, one assumption is that males in general, across the board, are biologically wired to have an obsession with erotic visual stimulation. So it's hardwired in their human biology. And I think you could look around and some people might say, yeah, that rings true.
Yeah, that's right.
But probably not all men. But anyway, there is something about that people look for maybe an evolutionary biological basis for. Mm-hmm. And the other assumption is that all men prefer women with hourglass figures, being because perhaps those waist to hip ratios, small waist, large breasts, large hips, evolved in women to be reliable indicators of female fertility. So what do you think about that?
That's interesting, isn't it? So I have some questions about that. And I have some questions about these figurines within what you were just saying as well. So kind of step back a little bit, and were these figurines mostly female that have been found through time? Are they Good. Okay, so great questions. And this is what the answers I'm going to give you are coming from a variety of research I've done, but one particularly wonderful article is by April Noel and Melanie Chang. It was a 2014 article in American Anthropologist that points out a lot of the assumptions and lack of data that are supporting this idea that the Venus figurines with paleoporn. So your very first question is a great one. Most of the figurines we have from the Upper Paleolithic are not female. Most of the figurines are actually of animals. Okay.
90% over 90% that we have recovered from this whole swath, this large geographical area in Western and Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, are of animals. And then the ones that are anthropomorphic, that look to be human, that's about 50-50 that we can even tell if they're male or female versus sort of androgynous. Okay. And then of the ones that we can tell, again, another half of them are probably female. So it's not by far this overwhelming majority of art that people made during the Upper Paleolithic. It's not like they were cranking out these voluptuous, curvy female figurines. And the other thing people note is that they, they focus on these secondary sexual characteristics, but they're also features that are associated with female fertility.
Okay.
So maybe not just the male sexual preference, perhaps.
Right. So when you say that, of course, that means that these figurines were emphasizing breasts and buttocks,
but also bellies in a lot of
Bellies,
cases. So when they talk about
hips.
the hip to waist ratio, some of these figurines have very protruding stomachs.
Okay.
And look pregnant. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So a lot of them don't necessarily have this hourglass figure. I also think it's kind of amusing to think about a bunch of archaeologists sitting in a lab with tiny little measuring tapes and measuring these little figurines. It doesn't sound very scientific to me.
Right.
And then measuring human women and trying to make a comparison with those ratios.
Right, exactly. And so, thinking about those, what these look like with the large hips, the large breasts, and then, of course, oftentimes large bellies, that might mean that these were pregnant women. And, of course, what happens when you are pregnant, since I've been pregnant and know.
Me too.
Is that everything grows when you're pregnant.
Yep, not just your belly.
Not just your belly.
And again, that's for most women. I'm sure it's not necessarily the same. We never want to say everything is always
true.
But obviously the trend is that, breasts are definitely getting larger and more full with milk. All women experience that. And your abdomen is obviously growing, but you tend to also get padding all around those areas between like your thighs and your shoulders.
Yeah, and just as women grow older too, thinking about not just that time of fertility or that time when women or that childbearing age, but as you grow older, your body becomes more padded, and your breasts become larger, but your whole body oftentimes
very few of us
women.
have the same body in our postmenopausal years that we did when we're at the height of our fertility in our teenage years, which is not necessarily when we have our kids these days anyway.
Right.
Exactly. So bodies change.
Bodies change over time.
They could be representing many things. So this idea that they were definitely sexual objects, I think some of them, maybe to some men, today in modern era might look that way. I think to other people cross-culturally, they might look very different. But this idea that they could be rated on their attractiveness based on their waist to hip ratio didn't seem very scientific. Also, it meant that they were leaving out a huge amount of the figurines in which the body proportions were actually very slim. And the figurines themselves were not even portrayed naked. There was clothing detailed on some of their features. So not all of them really even show these exaggerated characteristics or necessarily pregnancy.
So some of the figurines are not show very very kind of stick figure like figures.
Right.
Mm-hmm,
and then there's some figures where it's absolutely just and these things are made out of clay, out of stone, out of ivory, antler, bone, a huge range of materials, and they're made over tens of thousands of years. Yeah. So it's also hard to imagine that there's one explanation across time and across cultures, unless we're going to say we were biologically wired to produce them, but they don't all look alike. Some of them do share some amazing characteristics, but none of them all look the same. And I think that's really important to make that point, and to also not ignore, again, that there's such a small percentage of the art that Paleolithic people made. In the Upper Paleolithic, the Parietal Art, the art that you find on walls in caves, is almost entirely of animals or of geometric shapes. There's almost no humans represented.
Okay.
So
I know I've seen hands every once in a while, but that's probably a small.
That's it. You're showing, but not of a whole human body. So you might get most of an animal body or an animal head, but you don't get human heads represented. You do get the hands, as if documenting that they're there, or that they made the imagery that you're seeing, but not attempts to represent the form that way. So it seems to be that far more of the Paleolithic mind was consumed with thinking about animals and creating geometric symbols that must have had some meaning as well.
Okay. So some other things that I've heard and read recently about these female figurines were that they were you said that some of them are naked.
Yeah.
Some of them are naked, some of them are clothed, but the ones that were naked were used as kind of erotic symbols for these hunter-gatherer people.
Yeah.
And I just want to ask you about that. What do you think about that?
Yeah. First of all, it's sort of creepy to think about how these figurines might have been used erotically. So we won't ask what people do with the magazines that are under, right? We're just going to leave it at that.
We don't want to know.
But the idea that hunter-gatherers would have found naked breasts erotic or the naked body seems not to hold with what anthropologists know about most hunter-gatherer societies, in which seeing naked breasts would have been very common. And they're not necessarily thought of in the same way that men picking up a Playboy magazine might think about breasts today or anything like that. So to project that back would have been very different. So we don't have any cross-cultural evidence to presume that there would be a universal eroticism associated with naked breasts. A lot of the figurines, they are small and portable, and they some of them look like they have been held or even worn, that there would have been some hole.
So they were like worn like a necklace, or have a kind of a way to. We've got Sophie with us today, which is Nancy's little dog. She's a cutie.
She's a bit voluptuous herself.
Yeah, she is. She was making some growling noises.
Happier,
I don't know if it's
happier
me
now.
or...
No, she wanted to come up and be part of the conversation.
Okay. She
I think
wants just to sit with us.
Yes. So exactly. So they seem to have maybe even been worn like an amulet, transported. They may have been passed down. Some of them may have traveled. And then there's a super interesting theory at Dolny Vestonici in Eastern Europe, a site where very early on people were figuring out how to fire clay, and in some cases they intentionally left enough moisture in the clay when they would put it in a fire so that the thermal shock would make the objects explode. So they could find some objects made, and they could see areas where these were intentionally exploding, almost like some kind of divination ritual or something where they were intended to. So definitely they could have been used in different ways in different places, could have had very different meanings. So again, this idea that they represent this hardwired male idea, that they drove the physical form to change, to become an hourglass shape, to project fertility through that, to be universally recognizable. It's just a really heavy biological genetic argument that I don't think stands up well, as I like to say. Yes, you have that kind of argument of sexual selection that Darwin pointed out with the peacock's tail. A lot of energy goes into that tail, and the only thing it does is helps him get a female, maybe lets him outcompete if he's got the better tail and he can wag it and swag it. But you don't get all females having an hourglass figure, certainly across time, across cultures, and in different places. So it's hard to see that argument really having biological evidence, cultural evidence that supports it, because we also don't see the same preferences in terms of attractiveness across all cultures. No reason to expect that it would have been the same. Nevertheless, we bring it up all the time when we teach because it's so persistent. And I just want to read a few quotes so that we understand why this is something we want to address in this podcast, and to talk about how powerful some of these myths can become and how sticky and persistent. So when they found the most recent and oldest female figurine, the Hulls Fell Venus, they call it, in 2009, they published, and so many newspapers and science publications picked it up and would have titles like Paleolithic Pornography Unveiled, Smut Carved from a Mammoth Tusk, or Archaeologists Unearth Oldest Known 3D Pornography, Prehistoric Pinup, 35,000-year-old sex object, all these kinds of things. And this is 2009, which is hearkening back to the 1970s when this idea was first put down in print, where they first actually measured the hip-to-waist ratio and compared them to Playboy pinups and tried to make a scientific case for this sort of biological argument. that the bulging Venus breasts and enormous buttocks and pendulous breasts, you might have to turn this off if you've got young kids in the room, along with vulva drawn on the cave walls, were undoubtedly male art creations for themselves or for other men. And this is men writing this. And I don't think there's any bit of evidence that they were undoubtedly created by men for men. They seem much more likely to be created by women for women.
Right.
For fertility purposes. And the variations are so different. But we still see, these 2009 headlines mimicking these earlier ones. The figurines match almost exactly the erotic interests of sensually alert modern males. This is telling us much more about men in the 1970s, I think, than it is about Paleolithic men. And finally, the last one I'll read, female figures in Paleolithic art often appear in sexually inviting attitudes, which may be quite the same as those in the most brazen pornographic magazines, a straight line from Ice Age to Rodin to the Playboy bunnies of later years. And that was by Bjorn Curtin in 1986.
Interesting.
So more recently, we'd like to think that these ideas have gone away, but I think today we still get reflections of what is going on in our culture now, and that often drives our interpretations. And sometimes we go in then to an analysis with the bias baked in. So Randy White, who is an eminent Paleolithic archaeologist, he works at New York University, and he studies Neanderthals, early modern humans, and he did an amazing, exhaustive article, a study of what we can find out about these so-called figurines, Venus figurines and other figurines from the Paleolithic period. And he noted that the very earliest interpretations in the mid-1800s looked at Venus figurines not as potentially ideas of ideal attractiveness and of males' preference for a certain body form, but they were looked at as possible ways to understand different representations of racial groups. And so at that time in Europe, people were all about their identity, their homeland, their race, so very much reflecting that particular time.
Right.
So we see a complete move away from that. And then interestingly, this idea of fertility and the female maybe making these forms comes out in the 1970s when we have a feminist movement, and you see women looking down at their own pregnant bodies and bellies, and a gentleman did a very interesting study where he had women look down and photograph their own bodies, and then he photographed some of the figurines the same way, and they look like a dead ringer. It's in some cases,
because a lot of these figurines have large breasts and large legs, but then their feet are very, very tiny,
or not at all there,
at all there, and the heads are very small or not at all there,
and the arms are very tiny or not there either. So it's almost as if or tucked in around the belly or on the breasts, and they look very small, which is how it would look from your perspective. So that was a very interesting
that's interesting
perspective. So this idea of fertility really took hold with I think Marija Gimbutas' work, who she started as an archaeologist, a Lithuanian archaeologist, in the 1940s, and in the 1970s, I can't remember the name of the book, we had just been speaking of it, but she was talking about the idea of a fertility cult and a goddess cult, and this idea that these figurines might represent a time period where the figurines were not just maybe talismans for women, but they actually represented some ritual thinking, behavior, and that perhaps there was a lot of ritual or religious behavior that went into women's fertility and understanding that, and that being sacred at that time period, and that perhaps then women had a lot of power and deities maybe would have been perceived as feminine.
Right.
And of course that coincides with feminist movement.
Right, and a more matriarchal look at that. And of course, at that time in the 1970s, there was a huge feminist movement. So this got wrapped up into that movement as well.
Absolutely. So that held on for a while until there was a big backlash. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we move on to the Neolithic and the Malta period, because that's where the backlash, I think, was heaviest, because there's a little more known about that period than there is this Paleolithic context. We don't have a lot of good archaeological contextual data for these figurines. So it leaves much more room for interpretation and to just objectify the objects, to kind of study them out of their context. And one good example of that, and a recent example, is an article by Dixon and Dixon, who were both at the time teaching at the School of Biological Sciences at the Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. And they set out to determine if Venus figurines might be universally recognized as, quote, symbols of fertility or attractiveness, unquote. Okay. So what Dixon and Dixon were doing, I think, Crystal, is they were trying to sort of simultaneously test both the Venus figurines as porn and the Venus figurines as fertility figures or goddesses, kind of at the same time.
Right. Try to bring both of those ideas in to look at both of them side by side, which I think is kind of interesting and a little problematic. But anyway, keep going.
No, but how do you do that?
Yeah,
though, right?
Yeah.
How do you determine if they're symbols of fertility or attractiveness? How do we know what Paleolithic people were thinking? Well, Dixon and Dixon decided to investigate this hypothesis by showing pictures of 14 Paleolithic female figurines to a group of undergraduate students. And
how old were these undergraduates?
Yeah, good question. These undergraduates were an average age of 20. There was 161 of them. Okay. So they're young people, right?
Yeah, probably most hadn't gone through some of the things that these female figurines are showcasing, like pregnancy, or
I would expect very few of them were parents,
right,
that they were asking, and perhaps their ideas of attractiveness were no doubt largely circumscribed by the culture they're living in now. But they were asked to determine if the particular figurine they were looking at looked to be a woman who was of fertile age or pregnant, and rate the attractiveness. Just a picture of a figurine. I'm not sure what that they thought these opinions of 161 young heterosexual men and women were going to tell us about the Paleolithic mind. I'm not really sure this is good science to ask uninformed people to rate the attractiveness of these artifacts completely out of context.
And I guess my question is, what were their qualifications for attractiveness?
Exactly, and they do lay out all their. But it's just a number scale. But you're asking a group of people who are all very similar, so we're not getting a cross-cultural perspective, much less a temporal perspective, right? So you're not going to get a huge variety. You're going to get male and female, but the mean age is 20. There wasn't a huge variety even in age. So I know over the course of my life, what I consider attractive has changed, right? So I'm not really sure how we can objectively measure those things. It's always interesting to me to try to quantify those. But more importantly, what did we think this was going to tell us about what Paleolithic people were doing with these, or why they made them? And the most important thing I think I took away is that this kind of science perpetuates the objectification of the female form by men and women, looking at it, measuring it, rating it.
Isn't that what we're just trying to move away from?
I think so. And perhaps even these folks thought maybe they were trying to get away from this by this. But my question is, I don't see people doing this with with Greek statues that are naked, especially with rating the size or attractiveness of the genitalia of the male form. They're known to have particularly small phalluses on Greek statues. You can look that up online. We also know, that in many parts of the world, rock art that shows men often have very large, exaggerated phalluses, and I'm not sure that this is an example of attractiveness or necessarily fertility. Virility maybe, but I'm not sure we would sit down and have a whole bunch of people rate the attractiveness of those
of that rock
phalluses,
art.
and definitely not that they were realistic interpretations of what people look like, or even what their ideal would have been, for goodness sake.
And that's a really good analogy, Nancy, too, is that looking at that rock art of those male figures with these, very, very enhanced pieces of their body, just like
just like the women with the really, really large, in some cases.
And so, it is a good, but we don't see any studies. I've never seen one. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but I've never seen anything like this rating the attractiveness of those.
And we're not obsessing that the San women were obsessed with men with very, very large phallus. I mean, we never hear these presumptions being made the other way. It's usually the objectification is going one way. And that brings us to this final study we want to talk about, because you actually came across this.
Yeah, I came across it on Facebook, and there was a reaction to it, I guess, on Facebook, and so we were talking about doing this conversation here on our podcast about the figurines, about the female figurines, and then this article was published in 2020, and there was a reaction from a lot of archaeologists and historians on Facebook about this article. So I immediately sent it to you, Nancy, and you had a reaction as well.
I did. I found there to be a lot of baked-in assumptions again to this one. So I want to just describe for people what it is. There's 3 authors, Richard Johnson, Miguel Lanaspa, I'm sure I'm not saying that right, and John Fox. And it's primarily authored by medical doctors. They're not anthropologists. And it's an article published in the journal Obesity. And this is just in 2020, so just last year, the greatest year on record, right?
Right.
Upper Paleolithic figurines showing women with obesity may represent survival symbols of climatic change is the title. Okay, so the idea in this article is that they are going to look at Venus figurines, or these Paleolithic figurines, female forms, and see that if they represent an adaptive way to deal with advancing glaciers, climate stress, colder temperatures during the last episodes of the Ice Age in the Paleolithic period. So they start out by saying, obesity is rare in hunter-gatherer cultures. Now, this is a true statement. But then they say, nevertheless, dozens of handheld figurines of women with obesity have been identified that date to Ice Age European hunter-gatherers from 38 to 14,000 years BP. So right there in the first 2 sentences, that first sentence is fine, but they presume right away that these figurines are women with obesity. And we've already talked about how they most likely, before in the 70s, they were presumed to be the erotic ideal of men. Now, in this age where there's this obsession with women's bodies and dealing with diabetes and all sorts of things, the obsession with kind of body and fitness and issues, health issues surrounding obesity have become such an issue. This is the lens through which now these Venus figurines, the latest lens at which they're being looked at. And so the idea is, I'm not sure to figure out if that the figurines represent some adaptive strategy. So what they're hypothesizing is that the climate stress is requiring that women need to strive to become obese so that they could maintain their fertility during periods of stress. So tell me what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I guess what my question about that is, or my thoughts on that, is that are they calling pregnant women obese? Because there's, when I look at these figurines, I see them often, they're holding their bellies where they would be pregnant. They are obviously, like I talked about before, larger maybe because of pregnancy. So that really kind of devolves into that idea that, are they equating pregnancy with obesity? And I know that probably they have scientific qualifications for that word.
Let's remember, these are men who
Right,
don't ever
right.
get pregnant writing these articles.
Exactly.
That's a very, very dangerous impression to be leaving with us, that we're going to say pregnant women's bodies look like obese bodies, which my presumption is to them, obese bodies are a cause of study because they're unhealthy and unattractive, right?
Yeah,
That's the underlying assumptions, which are damaging, hurtful, and sort of the assumptions underlying this whole article. So, right, I think the first issue is a lot of these don't represent women that are obese, and they represent women who are in a fertile state.
Right.
And others of them, they just didn't look at. So when I looked at it, Crystal,
you were noticing this, that
they biased their sample.
They threw some things out.
Right.
Yeah,
so what
explain
they
that.
said, and I want to read it exactly because I don't want you to think I'm just making this stuff up, because they say it themselves. They talk about how they selected the figurines, how they measured them. Again, they do the waist to hip, waist to shoulder ratio of the female figurines, which I always find remarkable that people are measuring these little figurines as if they represent real human female dimensions, even when they don't have heads or feet.
Right.
And then they say that to ensure an unbiased determination, these images were randomly coded and all this, but they mention that they had to exclude some figurines because they were made of material that limited their dimensions. For example, engravings on antlers. So any engravings that they perceive to be made on an antler, which can only express so much change in girth or obesity, it naturally looks kind of slim and linear, they threw those out. So in other words, there's a whole other bunch of figurines, as we've mentioned, that are either androgynous or don't have these voluptuous proportions. So we have plenty of those, and somehow those are then not considered part of the sample.
Right.
So that's going to bias in favor, of course, of having these rounder proportions. But if you're presuming that they represent obesity rather than pregnancy, you're making this very strange equivalency between those two physical forms of obesity and pregnancy. And it's incredibly problematic, I think, with the interpretation. Again, I'm not sure, you and I were puzzling over this, what the point in a modern journal on obesity was to go this far back in the past and look at Venus figurines from this huge period and perhaps say that obesity is an adaptive strategy to maintain fertility. So two things for Marie for there. One is that I don't think any hunter-gatherer groups ever experienced obesity. As far as we know, we don't have any data demonstrating that. And I'm not sure how it's physically possible before you had farming, before you had high-calorie foods and you could stay sedentary in one place. I don't think obesity was possible. As we said earlier, pregnant bodies look rounder and fuller, so that makes sense, and why you might want to make art about that. That's where your new people are coming from those bodies. And then I lost my train of thought for the second one.
And the second one is that, I think this is where you're going. I don't know.
I hope you got it.
Is that, and this is what I was thinking anyway, is that also hunter-gatherer societies weren't often in starvation mode. I'm sure there was times of starvation, but they had their stuff down. They knew what they were doing. They were well fed. They were fed to the amount they needed to be. They had they didn't.
A lot of studies of hunter-gatherer groups that were done by anthropologists in the 60s and 70s do demonstrate that they have food and nutrition. And we know that we have people living above the Arctic Circle in these same Ice Age conditions who do just fine and don't necessarily have a reverence for obesity or problems with fertility. So clearly, if there are problems with fertility with hunter-gatherers, we wouldn't be here as a species. Exactly.
And maybe through our lens of today, we see hunter-gatherer groups as too skinny or having that look of starvation. But of course, that is through our lens, which is completely different.
Right.
And so, and that brings us to this idea of culture.
Yes.
And we all have our own cultural lens. And that is one thing that I see missing in this article, which, obviously probably is missing because they're medical doctors, and there is, I think, one anthropologist on the article. Is that correct? But
there is. So he's in the Department of Anthropology in the United Arab Emirates.
Yeah. So, but of course, as cultural anthropologists or as archaeologists or historians, we would look to culture for a lot of these answers, and they're looking in different places. And so we see the answers, of course, in culture, where they are looking for answers in biology. So more of a biological basis.
And interestingly, they're still saying the reason, of course, they find what they're looking for.
Right.
I believe their sample was biased, but they do say that the object of this obesity in their conclusion is to maintain female fertility. So it brings us back.
So it kind of comes back to fertility at the end anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's interesting.
So the idea is that we are still looking at these figurines as a way to deal with female fertility. Whether or not they were stressed, there might be other objective ways to measure the stress on the bodies of these hunter-gatherers relative to the bodies of hunter-gatherers of other places, if they really thought this is what was driving it in Europe. But it seems to me you might have more specific and local reasons, time and place, that might have had to do it. But ideas of fertility are very, very universal. And concepts of obesity are also very cultural, and I think probably don't really become more commonly thought about in terms of within a population to have people who maybe have a lot more body fat than others until you get into these sedentary Neolithic societies, and perhaps some people are moving more and have access to more and other people have less. And so with that, let's turn to the Neolithic. Let's turn to Malta.
Okay. Before we do that, we'll take a quick station break here. You are listening to The Dirt on the Past with co-hosts Nancy Mahoney and myself, Crystal Alegria, on kgvm.org Bozeman, or wherever you find your podcasts. We are speaking today about Venus, I'll put that in air quotes, Venus figurines, and the objectification of women's bodies. And some of these myths, some of the facts. So I'm glad you're here with us listening today. So let's move to the Neolithic and talk a little bit about some of these female figurines that have been found on the island of Malta. And Malta is near and dear to my heart because when I was in college, I did a study abroad. I did a semester abroad, and I studied in Malta. And for those of you who don't know where Malta is, it is right in the middle of the Mediterranean between Sicily and Africa. And it's just this beautiful little paradise. It's a wonderful place. And I had the opportunity to study there for a semester. And it was really life-changing for me to go to this culture because it's a completely different culture. And I had grown up in Montana, and I was, I had never gone out of the United States at this point in time. And so when I got on the airplane and flew to Malta, it was quite an amazing experience for this Montana girl to see the big wide world.
What an amazing experience. And Malta has it's only been something I've wanted to visit the place because of the archaeology there, but I think about the people and I'm thinking what an interesting place they inhabit, as you're saying, in the Mediterranean, between sort of Sicily and North Africa. And can you tell us a little bit about what the people are like there, and language they speak, cultural, whatever? Because it must be such an interesting,
it's a really interesting mix, because it's an island, so they've been colonized again and again and again by a lot of different people. But there's a real mixture of people speak Italian there. They speak English, they speak Maltese, so there is the Maltese language.
An indigenous language, too?
Yep.
Oh, wow.
But it is a mixture of a lot of other languages as well. And, there's Turkish influences, there's just all these different cultural elements coming together on this island.
And that Mediterranean world, such an amazing mix.
It really is. And so it was the perfect place for me to go to learn about the world. And like I said, it was life-changing. And so I spent a semester there, but the first few days, I was part of this college program, kind of one of those study abroad programs. And so the first few days, they had all of us study abroad students get together and go and visit different parts of the island. And one of the first places that we went to were these ancient temples, one of the ancient temple sites that is on Malta. And it was amazing, overwhelming, but, spectacular to see this temple, this old ancient temple. These temples are much older than even Stonehenge. They're some of the earliest temples in the world that were built. And
until they found Göbekli Tepe, which is fairly recent, and that dates to about 9,000 years ago. Malta has been known as having the very first megalithic architecture, large stone architecture anywhere. So this is the first for sure in Europe. And there's a large gap between Göbekli Tepe and this. But so there were farmers living there before they built this, but some from 5,000 BC.
Yeah, so it was settled about 5,000 BC.
Okay.
And of course, we're in the Neolithic now. So these are sedentary people. They're farmers, and they are farming on Malta. But they have a very structured, system as well, and that can be seen by these temples. And so it was amazing. It was amazing to see these temples. And of course, I was very young. I was I was probably 20 or so when I was there. It was a long time ago, in 1993, 94, in that time frame. And so seeing these temples was amazing, because I had not seen anything like this before.
What do they look like?
They're huge. They're these huge stone megaliths, like you said. And they're probably, of course, they might have had roofs on them, but at this point they don't have roofs any longer. But they stand, depending on the temple. There's quite a few throughout the island, but depending on the temple, the stones are kind of like what you think of when you think of Stonehenge. They're large, and
so they were moving
tower
massive
boulders,
tons.
Yeah. And they think that they moved them with these round rocks. So at some of the temple sites, you see these groupings of these round balls that are, these huge stones that have been made into a ball, where they would have put the stone on that and then rolled it.
Okay.
So, that's their theory.
I know, and no metal tools. So this is all done with stone tool technology.
Yep. But by people, not aliens.
Yeah. You sure? Yeah.
But yeah, they're very impressive. And then unlike Stonehenge, these ones are in size. They have art within them. They have spirals. There's spirals everywhere. There's
a lot,
pitting.
A lot of carvings on the stones.
Okay. Yeah. And they're very, when you go into them, you can see niches, you see altars, you see statues. There's still some statues in some of these megalithic structures. So that first couple days we were in Malta, we went and visited one, and then on my birthday, the group of people I was there that I got to be friends with, that I'm still friends with some of them. We still see each other yearly.
Those places create bonds.
They do.
When you're there together.
Do.
Yeah.
And so this group of friends, and we went to another one of the temple complexes, and within this temple complex there's actually a statue and we would call that a female statue, but half of it is missing, the upper torso half, and the head is missing. So you only see the bottom half from like the waist down. But the person or the statue has a skirt on and then very large legs. So it really kind of mirrors this idea of these female figurines that we've been talking about. But it's a statue, so it would stand probably, if the upper torso was on it, it would probably stand maybe 4 feet tall.
Wow.
So
kind
huge.
Of really big monumental statuary as well. Again, nothing like this at Stonehenge. This is, Malta is doing its own thing.
They've got their own thing going, and it's
everyone
amazing.
Else.
Yeah,
because at Göbekli Tepe, they were carving on those upright stones.
Right. These stones are very similar to that.
But this is actually sculpture 3-dimensional, and they're carving into limestone. And then they're even excavating these large caves, right?
Yeah, so they have these things called hypogeums, which are down below the Earth's surface. So they are carving down into the limestone of the island, and they're carving temples and places underneath the ground as well. So they have temples above ground, but then they also have these other places below ground.
Okay, Crystal.
That are very temple-like as well.
What were they doing in these structures, and why do we know they're temples and not houses?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question, and we don't know they're temples. We assume they're temples based on these niches and these altars and the other things that we see in them that remind us of other temples, of other sacred places in. They remind you of a church. If you've ever gone into a Catholic church, there's apses and there's, it reminds you of that when you go into these temples. So that's why I called them a temple. Some people don't call them temples.
Well, and they're so big. If they would have been a house, wouldn't you expect to see remains of just regular domestic everyday tasks, and then how many people would have lived in them? So in what ways do you think they're different, aside from just their size and the fact that a huge amount of labor must have gone into constructing them?
Right. And the reason is because of the artifacts that are found inside these temples as well. So in some of the temples, they've found lots of animal bone, burned bone, which could symbolize either sacrifices or feasting. They've also found bodies in skeletal remains in some of these temples, but also in the hypogeum. Those
parts of them are used
ground.
For people to deposit the dead,
right?
And then other places it looks like they're making offerings of either animals or other things and having. Okay, so that definitely doesn't sound like what you'd expect to find necessarily in a domestic structure.
No.
It's not your regular everyday trash.
But it's such a large amount of bodies. I think that in one of these places they excavated what one of the archaeologists has estimated as 7,000 bodies.
Right,
so,
right. And I think in the even more recent article in Archaeology magazine, they said there was over 100,000 human bones, separate human bones coming out of one of the parts they've excavated of a hypogeum.
Right.
So that's an amazing amount of people. And I think they're trying to make population estimates now based on that. So maybe 10,000 people living on the island or something.
Yeah. And it's a small island. It's not very large. And so to have all these temples, and then there's Malta is the main island, but then there's a smaller island next to that called Gozo, and there are some temples on Gozo as well.
Do they look similar to? Okay.
And then there's a very small, another little island called Camino. And so when I was there, I lived on Malta, but we did visit Gozo, and I saw the temple there, but one of the temples there. But it's an amazing temple complex. But within these temples, there were these figurines, these female figurines that we've been talking about from the Paleolithic, and they're, of course, probably had different meaning now during the Neolithic, but they are somewhat similar in their proportion size. There's small ones, there's big ones, there's the ones like I was talking about with the very large breasts and the large legs. In Malta, some of the figurines have large legs, large buttocks, no breasts.
Okay.
So it's kind of interesting. So, we talked about how some of the figurines are male, some are female, some we can't tell whether they're male or female. And, I think that brings up another point that we're just, today we've just been talking about male and female, but there may have been other genders as well.
This presumption that there's only two. There's plenty of figurines that are very androgynous, and they definitely could represent some sort of other conceptuations of gender beyond just this binary. So absolutely, we have to remember about that in the past, because we know so many cultures have third or more genders.
Or more genders,
absolutely.
Right.
So that's very interesting to hear about that. So there's large ones that also look female, smaller ones that look female. Some that may be male, we're not sure, or just some other gender.
Yeah.
Okay, and so what's been the interpretation there? How are these figurines referred to? I know there's one that's called the Venus of Malta.
Yep. There's one that's called the Venus in Malta, and she looks just like me. When you look in a mirror and you see yourself, and then you look at this figurine, it's like, oh, well, that's me, But
I see my physical shape as a woman there.
Right. So I mean, but there's in Malta.
You're the Venus of Bozeman.
I know.
Now.
I'm the
there
Venus.
we go.
I like that.
I like there you go.
And I think that's a lot of that's the fascination of these figures and these figurines that are so old.
Yeah.
25,000 years old, but they look like they look like me.
Yeah.
They look like you. They look like,
So talk a little bit about, we had mentioned Marija Gimbutas before, talking about a goddess cult. And what I know about Malta now is that it is a place where a lot of people go on goddess cult tours.
And I don't like to say cult. I like to say goddess movement.
Yeah. So tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah. So, there during the 70s, like we said before, there was this feminist movement, and along with that was a goddess movement, and the idea that cultures in the past had, instead of a patriarchal system, they had a matriarchal system. And Marija Gimbutas really...
So tell us what that means.
So that means patriarchal is a male-dominated society, whereas a matriarchal is a female-dominated, or not dominated, but hierarchical.
Women have higher status, hierarchy, and power. Okay, and it could mean that you even trace lineages, matrilineal, through the female side, versus, as we do in a lot of Western cultures, or have done, is through the male line. Now we really do both in our society. Yeah. But, so I think that was part of her point about most of these European societies, and Malta is one of these places maybe we could see it expressed, is the female form is so prominent. And I want to ask you a little bit more about not just the figurines, but even the shape of the architecture of the temples. I think I've heard referred to as being almost egg-like or womb-like.
Well, they talk about, so the archaeologists, when they talk about these, the outlines of the temples, they say they look very much like a female figure. Ah. And if you look at the plain view of the temple, you do see that. You see something, it looks like a head, and then it looks like the arms, and it looks like the hips.
Wow.
And so when you look at these temples, that's what you see. And so archaeologists have equated those two things.
And so this all comes together with this idea that perhaps the feminine was the more basis of sacred ritual, and again, perhaps the deity.
Religious.
So maybe that translated also into women, human women, having some higher status, maybe even authority or power.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Priestesses.
Which is something we see
goddesses.
go away later once the Bronze Age happens. So I just want to make sure that contrast is clear to people, is that later, once we see metal tools show up and we see Indo-Europeans come into Europe, you definitely see much more representation of men, and we see also in burials distinct differences in those who have more grave goods, seem to have more power and authority, mostly vested in men. Now, we don't see that in the Paleolithic. What about at Malta? Do we think men or women?
Well, if you would have talked to Marija Gimbutas when she was living,
right.
She died in early 1990s. But if you would have talked to her, she would have said that this was a matriarchal culture, that this was a women-centered culture based on these figurines and some of the vulva imagery within these temples, and some of the spirals within the temples. And so this, her ideas were coming out during the 1970s. She started publishing in the 1940s. She was from Lithuania, but she moved to the United States and had a job here in the United States. She was an academic.
Part of that feminist movement, even within anthropology. Then, yeah.
So she was publishing about this at that same time that feminist movement was starting. So she kind of got involved in it, wrapped up in it, and the feminist movement really put her up on the pedestal as their archaeologist. And because of that, some other archaeologists kind of started to move away from her theories and some of her ideas and there was kind of
challenged some of her interpretations.
Yeah.
Also, it got very swept up, as we talked about earlier, in kind of a more pop culture during that time period of women saying, see, back in the past, women were the ones,
right. They were
this whole idea that, I can bring home the bacon and cook it up and have it all, whatever. That in the past, women had power and authority. And if you're striving for equality in the present, to show that equality existed in the past, I think was something. So what she was trying to talk about in her archaeology was becoming very relevant and co-opted in the present. And then also co-opted, kind of like how, now you go to Stonehenge or Chaco Canyon to see have a solstice celebration, and people are doing this at Malta with celebrations of a goddess culture or civilization. Is that
Right.
So that turned off some archaeologists.
Yeah. So some archaeologists pulled away from that, and we see it within the literature because. We see some archaeologists in the 1980s talking about these figurines as goddess figurines, but then as time goes on, we see them not talking about these figurines as goddess figurines, but instead they are saying they're either female figurines or they are figurines, just the word figurine, and that's it. They are not even going to put a sex on this figurine.
They're not going to call them fertility, goddess, or even female necessarily.
They're going to even sometimes suggest that they're male.
Interesting.
And so kind of even going the opposite direction. So there was a real backlash to this this goddess
idea.
Movement.
Yeah.
And so we see that in the literature. And so they've moved completely away and have started describing these things very just by what they exactly see.
So they're not even talking about the structures as temples anymore.
And they've moved away from some people have moved away from even calling these temples, but they call them complex architecture, and that's where they'll stop.
So the archaeologists in their own literature, as they talk to each other, have moved very far away.
They are secularizing this.
They're secularizing it. So they're taking the ritual out of it, and they're taking the feminine out of it.
Yeah.
So this Venus of Malta is not, this potentially deity goddess, cult anymore. Though on the ground, if you go there today, it sounds like you'll still hear some things about that.
And tourism is always interesting, because you have to have a narrative. You have to have something engaging. I mean, with extreme history and with everything that we do, there always has to be a story. There has to be a narrative. It has to be engaging. And the same thing in Malta when they're trying to encourage tourists to come and spend money in their shops, they have to have a narrative. And so the goddess narrative is a really good one.
Right.
And, complex architecture versus temple.
Having something spiritual, not just secular. Right.
Yeah.
And then what's happening if it's not a goddess culture or female in there, how are they interpreting what goes on or who's got the control or power in these complexes?
Well, when we were preparing for this talk today, I was looking at a lot of videos about kind of tourism in Malta, and I saw some very interesting videos, but one of them was really striking. And then this was kind of a documentary that was made more recently, and it was about it was a interpretation of how these temples were used, and they were referring to them as temples and interpreting them as temples in this reproduction. It was kind of a documentary reproduction, and so they were showing what kind of activities, ceremonies would have taken place in this temple, and they had priests, performing male priests performing ceremonies within this temple, and it was a main male priest, and then like 4 or 5 males in the background who were supposedly probably priests as well, but not as much, kind of sub priests, I guess. And they were the ones performing ceremony, and I thought that was so fascinating, based on, this long history, or this more recent history of how this has been kind of interpreted from a goddess situation with these women in power to now this documentary showcasing, a reproduction of a male priest in this temple.
Wow, and I wonder what the evidence is for there being male priests, or if this is because they did mention priests also in the more recent archaeology article on Malta, the builders of Malta, and I thought, do we know if there were priests? Is there any representation or physical remains? The only thing I read was that there was an elderly woman who they found buried with this amazingly elaborate headdress of shells, and she was clearly interpreted as having some special status, and I guess because of her bones they knew she was a little more elderly, so that almost seems a little more in keeping with her having higher status in life, and she was found in one of these complexes. And that's to the point we want to credit some of where we did our research.
Yeah.
This article we found by Catherine Roundtree, The Case of the Missing Goddess, she calls it, Plurality, Power, and Prejudice in the Reconstructions of Malta's Neolithic Past. And she has this very interesting point she makes about that some have said Marija Gimbutas had a feminist and sacred or sacralizing bias in the interpretation of Malta's past, and she's actually saying now she sees more of this masculinist secularizing, so more male and more secular bias in the archaeological interpretations. So this is where we want to get to the point of what's the facts themselves haven't changed that much. We are learning more through the archaeology, but the lenses have really changed, and to really be aware of this is something we're always trying to do at Extreme History and to be aware of. And also I think is telling us is so much about ourselves as it tells us about the past and our attempts to relate and interpret it.
And that's what we do as in our work. We're always looking at things from a different lens, from a new lens. Each generation has a theory for these figurines, and of course that's just what everybody's doing, that we talked about today. All the different academics that are doing this work, they're looking through their own particular lens to try to better understand the past so you can understand yourself.
Right.
And you can understand your own culture, and you can understand what's happening in the present. And so then of course that's what we're doing today, because we're discounting some of this work, but then we're agreeing with some of the other people who have written some of these articles. So we're trying to understand this through our own personal lens. And when I first saw that article on in the obesity journal, I mean, that was a tough one. And I have to say that, I told my husband about it, and he's like, oh, you're just, bringing this and making it about yourself. And probably I am, but I think that's something that...
But there's some serious flaws and biases in the way they did their study, and even the reason for doing their study. I'm sure you can find correlation if you just select the right group of figurines.
Right,
so it's hard for me to look at that as serious. But there's one other group of people who who have interpretations of what went on in Malta, the indigenous folks.
Yes.
Yeah, that Roundtree also talks about. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that article that we read by Roundtree, she was talking about how, in all this that we've talked about, not many of the scholars that have written up have talked to the indigenous people. And at Extreme History, that's one of our main focuses, is always to talk to descendant community members. And so when we were reading this article by Roundtree, she talks about how she had seen this lack of talk with descendant communities, with indigenous people living in Malta. So she went and she started talking to them. And she said that when she sat down and had conversations with some of the people who currently lived in Malta, she said that there was a legend, and they call it a legend, that the temple of, there's a temple, that the temples, and especially this one temple, were built by Sansuna, which was a superwoman or giantess who built the temples by transporting the megaliths on her head from one side of the island to the other. And she was sustained in this by eating beans and honey. And while doing all this work, she carried a baby at her breast.
And she could do it all.
I was like,
seriously,
like
is this the origin of Wonder Woman right here in Malta?
Right,
building?
Exactly.
I know, right?
So, so I think that's so interesting, that idea of giants, and that comes in quite a bit within the this legend of how these temples were built, because they are so large and these stones are so large. And of course, we today currently are trying to figure out how Stonehenge was built and how these megaliths in Malta were built, how the temples of Egypt were built. And, I always go back to say, well, these people had amazing civilization and technology, and they were able to do this. We've just lost some of that knowledge. Some people say it's aliens. I do not think that it's
we're not
aliens.
going there.
I think
that's
it is
not
us,
even on the table.
People.
It's much more interesting story anyway. And the aliens would have left something behind if they were here.
So, so maybe these people were giantesses in their own right, that they were giants of technology and were able to make these temples. But I love that idea, and I love that legend, and kind of going back and talking to the Maltese themselves and figuring out more about their myths and their mythologies and their origin stories. And it
adds another important layer to understanding what these objects mean, what they mean in the present, what they meant in the past. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's telling us something about what people who made them believed about their own origin stories. I want to give a quick shout out to Marija Gimbutas, because she took a hard hit from a lot of archaeologists, and both male and female. One archaeologist in particular, who's extremely well known all over, huge in the field, Colin Renfrew, was particularly critical of her interpretations of what was going on in the early Neolithic in Europe and the origins of Indo-European speakers, which she felt came and invaded from the steppes of Asia, and that they took over and really swept out this more feminine goddess culture and replaced it with a much more masculine. And this is when we have Bronze Age coming in and we see these changes. And Renfrew has recently vindicated a bit of her work. So part of it comes from genetic studies that do show the origins of the Indo-Europeans coming from where she said, not where actually were postulated by Renfrew, but also that his excavations throughout the Cycladic Islands, also in the Mediterranean, have confirmed her interpretations that a lot of these ancient female figurines, there's beautiful Cycladic figurines. Those are the things I fell in love with when I went to Cyprus about the time you were visiting Malta.
Yes.
That they are religious in nature, ritual, not toys or porn, as other people have said in other archaeological circles. So it's nice to see that a lot of these ideas are revisited, retested with data, rethought through a new lens. And I think this idea about fertility and it being so important to ritual and people understanding of their origins is really what comes through to me through everything we've read and even through all the cycles and different lenses. That even in the story of the gigantus, she has a baby at her breast.
Right.
It's a woman, it's fertility, it's strength, it's some kind of supernatural entity. And I think that ties together that sacred, that feminine, that fertility, that origin story that I think so many in the Paleolithic and the Neolithic we're trying to understand, and which we're still trying to understand today, our place in the world.
Yeah. And, that's exactly what it's all about, is trying to understand our place in the world and our present. And over these many thousands and thousands of years, these figurines and these statues probably meant different things to different people at different times, and they mean something to us. And so it's fun to look at them, and it's important to look at them and to understand what they tell us.
So thanks for being with us on this journey. We've certainly enjoyed it. I hope it sparked some interest. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you can join us again to find out more about
The Dirt on the Past.
If you're enjoying The Dirt on the Past, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And please tell your friends and leave us a review. It really helps people find us. We're a new podcast and are trying to grow our listener base. So please share. Thanks, and thanks for listening.
You've been listening to The Dirt on the Past, a podcast of the Extreme History Project and Gallatin Valley Community Radio, KGVM. To hear more episodes, visit our website at theextremehistoryproject.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep searching out the dirt on the past.